Welcome back to Clean Revenge. My name is Aria had learned a long time ago that silence could be sharper than any blade. But that afternoon, seated at the far end of her mother's polished mahogany dining table, watching her 8-year-old son stare at a glass of water while the scent of buttered lobster drifted through the room, she felt something inside her crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet. Precision of glass fracturing under pressure. The chandeliers above glittered like a celebration. Silverware chimed against porcelain. Her sister Vanessa's laughter rang through the dining hall, loud and careless. The kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had never been told no in her life. "We don't feed extras," Vanessa said casually, sliding a simple water glass across the table toward Aria's son Noah, as if she were passing salt. "He can drink this." The room didn't go silent. It was worse than that. It stayed normal. Forks continued to move. Butter dripped over crimson lobster shells. Vanessa's children dug into their platters, cheeks glowing with entitlement. And Aria's mother, perfectly styled, pearls resting against her silk blouse, didn't correct her daughter. Instead, she added, cool and precise, "You should know your place." Aria didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just smiled. A small smile, the kind that hides a storm. Noah looked up at her, confusion in his wide brown eyes. He wasn't old enough to understand humiliation, but he understood difference. He understood that his cousins had gold-rimmed plates while he had condensation sliding down thin glass. Aria reached for his hand under the table and squeezed it gently. And then she said, calmly, almost sweetly, "Hold on. It's 24:50. Her sister frowned. "What?" Aria checked her watch. A slim, understated piece of brushed platinum. No logos, no diamonds, just precision. "The chef should be arriving." Vanessa blinked. "What chef?" Aria didn't answer. She leaned back in her chair instead, relaxed, composed, as if she were waiting for something inevitable. Because she was they had always underestimated Aria. Growing up, she had been the quiet one. The middle child. Not loud like Vanessa. Not fragile like their younger brother. She had been observant. Analytical. The kind of child who noticed when bills piled up in drawers. The kind who heard whispers behind closed doors. Vanessa had been their mother's pride, beauty pageants, luxury tastes, social climbing instincts sharpened early. Their mother invested in appearances, in presentation, in alliances. Aria invested in knowledge. While Vanessa mastered curated charm, Aria mastered systems. At 17, she left home with one suitcase and a scholarship letter. No farewell dinner, no tears, just silence. Her mother had said, "You'll come back when you realize how hard the world is." Vanessa had laughed. They never imagined she wouldn't need to. They never imagined she wouldn't come back for help. They never imagined she'd come back for something else. The doorbell rang. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with authority. The kind of ring that announces importance. The housekeeper hurried to the door. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Who even comes uninvited to a private lunch? Aria sipped her water calmly. Footsteps echoed in the marble foyer. Then a voice. Polished. Professional. Delivery for Miss Aria Laurent. The surname hit the room like a dropped glass. Laurent. Vanessa froze mid-bite. Their mother's fork stopped inches from her mouth. Because Laurent wasn't just any name. It was attached to one of the fastest growing hospitality investment groups in the country. The kind of company that acquired luxury resorts, Michelin star partnerships, private culinary contracts, the kind of name that had been in business magazines for the past 3 years. The housekeeper stepped aside, and behind her walked a man in a tailored chef's coat, embroidered in gold thread. Chef Matteo Varela. Yes, that Matteo Varela. Matteo Varela. 3 Michelin stars. International acclaim. A waiting list that stretched 6 months for private bookings. He walked directly toward Aria and bowed his head slightly. "Miss Laurent, I apologize for the delay. Traffic from the airstrip. Vanessa's lips parted. Aria stood gracefully. Perfect timing, chef. Mateo gestured toward the entrance, and suddenly 2 assistants entered behind him carrying silver dome trays. The aroma that filled the room wasn't buttered lobster. It was truffle, saffron, seared perfection. Mateo's staff began setting an entirely separate table beside Aria and Noah. Crystal stemware, handcrafted porcelain, gold accented cutlery. Vanessa found her voice first. "What is this?" Aria tilted her head slightly. "Oh, you said you don't feed extras." She glanced at Noah. "So I brought our own." Mateo himself lifted the first dome. Inside, butter poached lobster tail resting on saffron risotto, crowned with edible gold leaf. The irony was exquisite. Vanessa stared at her own platter, suddenly ordinary. Their mother's composure cracked first. "Aria, what is going on?" Aria didn't raise her voice, didn't boast, didn't gloat. She simply reached into her handbag and placed a leather folder on the table, embossed, Laurent Global Holdings. She opened it slowly. Inside were property acquisition documents. Signed, stamped, official, including the deed to the very home they were sitting in. Vanessa's face drained of color. Their mother's hand trembled. "I closed on this property last month," Aria said softly. "The bank didn't give you much notice, did they?" Silence swallowed the room whole. Aria met her mother's eyes. "You told me I should know my place." She glanced around the dining hall. "This is my place." Noah smiled for the first time that afternoon as Chef Mateo placed the final dish before him, perfectly plated, equal, respected. Vanessa whispered, You bought this house?" Aria's expression didn't change. "No." She paused. "I bought the entire development." Aria did not rush the silence. She let it stretch across the dining room like a tightening wire, watching as the weight of her words settled into every corner of the house her mother once ruled like a queen, because power, she had learned, was not in raising your voice but in controlling the temperature of a room. And right now, the air felt thin, fragile, almost breakable. Vanessa's fingers trembled against her fork as if the silver had suddenly turned heavy, her perfectly contoured face losing color with every second that passed, while their mother attempted to reclaim composure by straightening her pearls, a reflex Aria noticed. The same reflex she used years ago whenever the bank called during dinner and she pretended nothing was wrong. But this time there was no pretending. Because the documents resting on the table were real. The signatures real, the transfer complete. And the foundation beneath their feet had already shifted. "You're bluffing," Vanessa finally whispered, but it lacked conviction. It lacked that sharp superiority she carried like perfume. And Aria almost pitied her because she remembered what it felt like to believe comfort was permanent, to believe status could not evaporate, to believe that the world arranged itself around you simply because you were used to being served first. Yet here they were, confronted with a reality they never prepared for, that the quiet sister who left with one suitcase had returned not for approval, not for apology, but for ownership. Chef Mateo and his assistants continued their service with flawless professionalism, placing course after course before Aria and Noah as if the rest of the room did not exist, as if humiliation had a seating chart and the roles had simply reversed. And Noah, sweet, observant Noah, began to eat with shy excitement, unaware that this was more than a meal. That this was a lesson unfolding in real time about dignity, about patience, about the power of restraint. Their mother finally spoke. Her voice lower now, measured. "Aria, if this is some." Kind of stunt, but Aria gently closed the leather folder and met her gaze with calm certainty. "It's not a stunt." Escrow closed 32 days ago. The grace period ended this morning. Legally, you're guests. And the word guests echoed differently than extras had. Heavier, deliberate, surgical. Because Aria had chosen not to strike back with cruelty, but with structure. Not with insults, but with contracts. And Vanessa pushed back her chair abruptly, the scrape against marble. sharp enough to fracture whatever illusion of control remained. "You wouldn't dare," she snapped. But Aria's expression never shifted. "I already did." And for the first time since Aria stepped back into that house, she saw it. Fear, not loud, not dramatic, but creeping slowly into their posture, into their breathing, into the understanding that the hierarchy they had relied on was dissolving in front of them. Outside, through the grand windows, black vehicles lined the driveway. Not flashy, not theatrical, just efficient. Representatives from Laurent Global Holdings waiting patiently for instruction, because Aria never acted without layers, never made a move without timing, and as she lifted her glass and took a slow sip, she realized something profound. Revenge did not feel explosive. It felt controlled. It felt earned. It felt like watching a structure collapse exactly the way it was designed to, brick by brick, and this was only the beginning. Aria allowed the silence to mature before she spoke again, because timing was everything, and she had not spent the last decade building an empire just to rush a moment that had taken years to engineer. And as Vanessa stood frozen beside her chair and their mother's breathing grew shallow with calculation rather than emotion, Aria folded her hands neatly on the table and looked around the dining room, not as a daughter returning home, but as a shareholder evaluating an asset, observing the crown molding, the imported marble, the crystal chandelier she remembered her mother bragging about. At charity galas, all of it purchased on leverage, on appearances, on borrowed credibility, and she almost admired the audacity of it. Except audacity without discipline always collapses. "You don't understand what you've done," her mother said finally, regaining a fragment of authority in her tone. But Aria tilted her head slightly, composed, analytical, the way she did during board negotiations when older men underestimated her before signing documents they later regretted. "No," she replied softly, "I understand exactly what I've done. I executed a recovery acquisition," and the words sounded clinical, distant, which made them sharper than anger ever could have been. Because Aria was not acting from wounded pride. She was acting from strategy. She reached into her handbag once more and slid another envelope across the table. Thicker this time, deliberate, and Vanessa hesitated before opening it as though the paper itself might burn her fingers, and inside were structured agreements, relocation terms, transition timelines, financial disclosures, all professionally prepared, all stamped with the insignia of Laurent Global Holdings, and their mother's face shifted from disbelief to comprehension. Because she recognized leverage when she saw it, she recognized that this was not personal theatrics, but corporate precision. "You're evicting us?" Vanessa whispered, but Aria's gaze remained steady. "I'm offering options," she corrected calmly. "You can remain here for 90 days under a transitional lease agreement. Market rate. Or you can accept the severance clause and relocate immediately. I've arranged comparable housing." The cruelty of it was not in displacement, it was in generosity. Because Aria had ensured they would not be ruined, not financially destroyed, not publicly exposed, she had ensured the press would see a standard development restructuring rather than a family fallout, and that restraint unsettled them more than vengeance would have, because it meant she had risen above the emotional battlefield they once dragged her through. Vanessa slammed the folder shut, pride flaring. "You think money makes you powerful?" And Aria almost smiled at how small the accusation sounded. "No," she answered quietly, glancing at Noah, who was finishing his dessert with innocent contentment. "Money reveals who was powerless all along," and the statement lingered like perfume in cold air outside one of the black vehicles. Engines turned off, subtle, patient, a reminder that the world beyond this dining room was already aligned with Aria's authority. And as Chef Mateo signaled the completion of service with a respectful nod, Aria rose from her chair with unhurried grace, smoothing her dress as if concluding a standard business luncheon rather than dismantling a decade of condescension. And before walking toward the foyer, she paused, turning back just slightly, her voice even, almost gentle. "You told me to know my place," she said, eyes locking with her mother's. "Now you're learning yours." And in that moment, the collapse was no longer theoretical. It was structural, inevitable, unfolding exactly according to plan. Aria did not leave immediately after delivering the terms. Instead, she stepped toward the grand windows overlooking the manicured lawn and watched as the black vehicles remained parked with disciplined patience. Because real power never rushes, it waits until resistance exhausts itself. And behind her, she could hear the quiet panic beginning to fracture the illusion her family had lived inside for years. Vanessa's voice shifted from outrage to calculation, rapidly scrolling through her phone as if influence could be summoned on demand, as if a few desperate calls to social acquaintances could undo signed contracts and sealed acquisitions. But one by one, those calls went unanswered, and Aria knew why. Laurent Global Holdings had already absorbed the surrounding properties in the development over the last quarter, quietly, strategically, leaving her mother's estate. As the final piece, and when markets move, loyalty follows capital, her mother stood slowly, walking toward Aria with forced composure, lowering her voice into something almost pleading yet still edged with pride. "Why are you doing this?" And that question lingered heavier than accusation, because beneath it was confusion. They had expected anger, bitterness, drama, not precision. Aria turned slowly, her expression not cruel but resolute. "Because humiliation teaches," she said calmly, "and I needed you to understand what you served my son today." And the word struck deeper than the contracts ever could, because this was no longer about property. It was about dignity. Vanessa scoffed weakly. It was just a joke. But Aria's eyes hardened for the first time. Not loud, not explosive, just final. "No," she corrected. It was a reflection of how you see people. And silence consumed the room again, heavier this time, because now the imbalance was moral, not financial. Outside, a small group of local real estate representatives gathered near the gate. Not media, not spectacle, simply business observers aware of a significant acquisition closing, and Vanessa noticed them through the glass. Realization spreading across her face that whispers would travel, that society would adjust its alignment, that invitations would change. And Aria saw it, the unraveling, not dramatic, but inevitable, the moment. When status built on exclusion begins to rot from within, and without raising her voice, without demanding apology, Aria delivered the final instruction of the day. 90 days. She repeated softly, "Use them wisely," before taking Noah's hand and walking toward the door, leaving behind not chaos, but consequence. The story did not end in that dining room. It evolved quietly over the following weeks, as contractors arrived to assess renovations and financial auditors began restructuring the development. And while Vanessa scrambled to maintain appearances at charity luncheons that suddenly felt colder, Aria remained unseen, operating from a distance the way she always had, deliberately, invisibly, because her revenge had never been about spectacle. It had been about correction. One evening, near the end of the 90-day period, her mother requested a private meeting, and Aria agreed, not out of obligation but closure, meeting her in the same dining room now stripped of excess decor, sunlight revealing imperfections once hidden by luxury. Her mother looked older, not physically, but in certainty, and when she spoke there was no superiority left, only awareness. "I underestimated you," she admitted quietly, and Aria considered the weight of those words, remembering the scholarship letter, the silence, the dismissive laughter, and she realized something unexpected. She was no longer angry. "You didn't underestimate me," Aria replied gently. "You underestimated discipline," and that distinction mattered. Because her success had not come from revenge, it had come from patience, from refusing to internalize humiliation, from building instead of begging. Vanessa, meanwhile, had accepted relocation under the severance agreement, moving into a smaller but respectable property. Funded by Aria's structured offer, and though pride remained intact on the surface, something had shifted in her eyes. Not gratitude, not resentment, but humility forming slowly like a bruise. Aria had not destroyed them, she had repositioned them, and that was the true power move. Because anyone can burn a bridge, but it takes control to own the land on both sides. 3 months later, the estate reopened, not as a private residence, but as a boutique culinary retreat under the Laurent portfolio. A space where young chefs trained under rotating Michelin mentorship programs, including Chef Matteo himself, and on opening night, invited guests filled the courtyard with admiration rather than envy. Unaware of the family war that once echoed within those walls, Aria stood near the entrance beside Noah, who wore a tailored suit and held himself with quiet confidence, no longer the child staring at a glass of water. And as cameras flashed and investors praised the transformation, her mother approached slowly, now simply a guest, and offered a respectful nod rather than entitlement. And in that subtle gesture, the hierarchy had permanently shifted. Vanessa arrived later, quieter than usual, observing the success with complex emotion. But when she knelt slightly to speak to Noah and asked about school with genuine warmth, Aria noticed growth, uncomfortable but real. And as the evening unfolded under golden lights, Aria realized her revenge had never been about humiliating them publicly. It had been about redefining what place meant, about proving that dignity cannot be assigned by those who fear losing control. And when a journalist asked her during the soft launch what inspired the acquisition, she answered simply, opportunity, because the deeper truth did not need broadcasting. Those who needed the lesson had already learned it. She looked down at Noah, squeezing his hand gently, and thought back to that afternoon at the table. The lobster platters, the sliding water glass, the phrase "know your place." And she smiled, not with bitterness, but certainty. Because now everyone knew that if this story moved you, remember this: silence is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And knowing your place doesn't mean accepting the one others assigned to you. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destruction, it's elevation. If you believe dignity always wins in the end, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Build quietly, move strategically, and when the moment comes, let your success speak.